I have had this question that I wanted to explore with Victoria since I saw you a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this briefly, which is what the fuck is up with the American auto manufacturing industry? Why is it the way that it is? And how come at a time where nothing seems more important than the electrification of transport, the American auto industry has allowed the electrification of transport to be taken forward by a series of hucksters, including but not limited to Elon Musk, and then the rest of the auto production capacity seems to be devoted to like the Ford F-150 Big Dick Edition that has like a 2-foot square truck bed and then like a V14 engine.
Yeah. Obviously you've pointed out correctly in the conversations we've had in the past that, China realized sometime in the 2000s that they were not going to overtake us in internal combustion cars because we just had like a 100-year head start. And most of what they were making at this point was like cars under license or badge engineered stuff from like Isuzu or, various Japanese companies. So they were like, okay, what if we do like battery electric cars? And they started doing this around the same time that, Tesla was launching its first model, which was the Roadster, if you remember that, which was kind of like a Lotus chassis with a bunch of batteries strapped into it. They made like 4,000 of them. It's primarily notable as the vehicle in Tony Stark's garage to signal that he's like cool with it, back when tech and entrepreneurs were like people that were admired instead of reviled. And, the pet theory that I've developed kind of in the intervening decade is that the US's economy is not structured to allow us to transition to really any other form of like transportation. We had the initial automobile revolution because we were operating under a system of, Fordist economics. Is it okay if I just launch into this? Is this
Go for it? Launch your podcast.
I just want to make sure that this is okay.
This is, what this is? This is we're workers on a board, and Victoria is consulting us in a way that's non-binding.
I feel so included.
It's the concept of like CEO with anxiety is just so funny, honestly.
It's like all they talk about these days is the thing.
So Fordism is a term coined by Antonio Gramsci in the 30s, where he described the American economy's structure, and he outlined it as a twofold project. You create a new man who is capable of working in an assembly line, and you do so by paying him a high, stable wage. You put him in a city that you have created, and you create the moral code and rules around, and you essentially sculpt him into something that's compatible with the culture that you need to pump out cars. And in the process of paying him like a living wage so that he can do all this stuff, so you can exercise this degree of control over his life, you turn him into a consumer of the product he's building. So essentially, the automobile revolution at its earliest days, when the Model T was first introduced, was largely purchased by the people who made them. There was a ready-made consumer base in the form of the factory employees. And the U.S. kind of stuck with this model up until sort of industrial decline in the 60s and 70s. And then we began offshoring, and we switched to kind of like a knowledge worker economy and shuttered factories. And, then we did Thatcher Reagan neoliberalism, and we're kind of familiar with where that's ending up right now. And so as companies stopped focusing on, making products that made money as a means of making money, they switched to, increasingly financializing things. So, loans, things of that nature. That is a whole, I thought about getting into that with this, but it's too complicated for a single podcast. You will have to have me back. Well, I guess I run it now, so that's the next episode. But one of the ways that, they've kind of shifted the way that they make money is to transition from paying out dividends to doing stock buybacks. This happened in 82, I believe, when Reagan changed the law to make it so you were allowed to do stock buybacks, and that just pumps up the stock value basically, and it increases revenue per share to a point where it's rewarding current investors for sticking with the stock. And this has become how the U.S. economy works, and that applies to the big three, for example. It was just as recently as 2023 that the UAW called a strike over compensation at big three factories because Stellantis, Ford, and GM had just sunk $5 billion into stock buybacks after they had been, systemically cutting wages and, freezing benefits for years. This year alone, GM is allocating $6 billion to stock buybacks. Meanwhile, they spend about $9 billion a year on research and development. If we compare this, that's about 6% of their total revenue a year. BYD, which recently took the crown from Tesla to become the world's largest EV manufacturer, spends roughly 8% of their revenue on research and development. XPeng, which no American has ever heard of, but is makes quite desirable EVs in China, is sitting at 20% of its revenue on R&D. NIO, which makes the adorable battery swappable Firefly compact car that basically competes like the 500e and like sort of like smart city car style vehicle, which also costs $17,000, which is I think $4 or $5 less than you can buy any car at all in America for right now. They spend like 30% of their revenue on R&D.
This is where you get the like automotive journalist goes to China, tries the cars and goes, wait a second, these are all really good genre of article, right?
Yeah, this is Kevin Williams is a friend of mine who's done a lot of the reporting on this, and he is every time he goes to China, he comes back and he writes a headline that basically says, including literally, we are cooked. Like he's done 2 articles. One of them was like Tesla is cooked. One of them is like America is cooked. And they all come to the same conclusion, which is that like China is building affordable, desirable EVs without really having to like use the government to influence its consumers unduly to be like, oh, hey, we'll give you tax credits. We'll give you like, preferred parking. It's like, no, they're good cars. People just want to buy them. Mm-hmm. But, there's more on that in a second because it's so systemic. There's so many levels at which they've beaten us that if you were like, hey, Vicky, we've made you automotive czar. You have to remake America's economy overnight. But crucially, you can't do communism because that would be my first answer. I would be like, you can't fix it. It's just we are actually cooked. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you may be wondering to yourselves, like, okay, so you've told me about General Motors, which is like kind of emblematic of the old way of building cars. What about like some sort of interesting upstart from like a charismatic dynamo of an executive, like Tesla, let's say? They spend 5% of their revenue on R&D, so it's actually less than General Motors.
But they're building all those humanoid robots.
The move fast, break things school does not actually spend very much money on breaking things. Anyway, the end result of this whole sort of picture of Americans not spending any money on R&D and China spending a ton of money on R&D is that China basically runs the board for patents right now. And through a combination of like a little bit of divine providence and a lot of money, they controlled most of the supply chain for lithium iron phosphorus batteries, which are referred to as LFPs. These are way better than what most American companies were using up until recently because they don't contain cobalt, which is incredibly expensive and requires like child slave miners to get, and are environmentally disastrous. They cost less money to make. These LFP batteries, they are more energy dense. They're way better in every regard, and China controls most of the supply for them, which wouldn't necessarily need to be a problem, except in the US, we have a bipartisan consensus as the Biden administration basically banned Chinese cars from America, and then Trump was like, hell yeah, we're definitely doing that. That's like the one thing that they kept in EV policy is like, we are not allowing Chinese cars on American roads.
Yeah, we can't have anything good is the thing.
Yeah, no. Well, because correctly, they have assessed that if you allowed a Chinese car into the American ecosystem, it would immediately wipe out all competition. It would be like introducing like, I don't know, brown bears to the Galapagos. Just complete ecological collapse.
Or indeed humans to the Galapagos.
You'll send a Chinese car to Ohio, and then all of a sudden, like the person who like will get out of the car speaking perfect Mandarin.
I understand the governance. Reading The Governance of China by Xi Jinping, like in hardback because it was just in the glove compartment. It's just like, I understand now. I get it now. We have to sinicize all the mosques.
Yeah.
And to be fair, Xi Jinping, that's a guy who's investigating the mosques.
Yeah,
he's been talking to Tommy Robinson. Like, I don't know.
So I think one of the things that you alluded to earlier, Victoria, is China's approach to this didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't particularly reactive. The Chinese electric vehicle boom didn't start with people seeing TikToks of BYDs. It started in the 2000s, decades ago. It started like a quarter century ago.
Yeah.
Where like, again, there was a realization, I'm quoting here from the MIT Technology Review, they realized they would never overtake US, German, and Japanese legacy automakers on internal combustion engine innovation. And research on hybrid vehicles, whose batteries in the early years served a secondary role relative to gas engine, was already being led by countries like Japan. So the Chinese government took steps to invest in related technologies as early as 2001. EV technology was introduced as a priority science research project in China's 5-year plan, the country's highest level economic blueprint. And
imagine having a 5-year plan. Imagine having a 5-year. Imagine having a plan at this point.
Yeah. The plan right now seems to just be concede that reform is right about everything and declare war on one Irish author.
Just to build on the point about 2001 also, it's not like EVs were totally unheard of, because if the real EV heads remember that 2001 was when General Motors discontinued the very, very forward-looking EV1 program that was wildly popular. It became like the subject of the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car. I think I've talked about it here before. But it was very much like, ooh, there could be something here. And America, at this stage, had spent a lot of money on trying to get EVs going, and they were like, actually, you know what? Hummer is coming out in like a year. We should absolutely double down on that.
Generational fumble.